Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Howard Milke.
So, I've learned a lot already. The Pure Project, I think we need to bring that down to New Orleans. I'm always having difficulty getting people interested in doing what we know needs to be done. So, what I'm going to do is start out by giving a background on how we learned what we learned and what it means to people living in cities. Now, cities are really important places. The built environment currently houses about over 50% of the human population. And if we don't figure out what is going on in cities in terms of supporting the health of the youngest of our society, it's going to be very difficult to sustain our society. I'll give you some sense of what problems are. Let's see, how do I do this? Okay. The people I'm working with, Chris Gonzalez and Eric Powell and myself, we're the ones who have been doing the work fundamentally in New Orleans. And I will show you some maps of New Orleans later on. The additional people that are working with me actually are the people from the Louisiana Department of Health in the Healthy Homes and Lead Prevention Program. And they've provided the blood lead. And we've then organized all the blood lead in the same way we organize soil lead. So it provides a way of getting a layering of the relationship between soil lead and blood lead. Now, let's see. I tried that once before. It didn't work. Let's try it again. Oh, that way. Okay. There must be something I'm doing wrong. How do I move forward? Interesting.
Is there any young people in the room?
Yeah, is there a 5-year-old? Who knows that? Okay, we can do it this way. All right. So, the big story I think that you've read about is the Flint story. And the Flint story is an interesting one to all of us because, of course, it put emphasis on lead, but more because it put emphasis on lead in water under a terrible situation. The people who were in charge of the economics took over basically the system, and they introduced the water into the system that was low pH, in other words, acid, and it started scouring the pipes and released the lead. But one of the things that my colleagues and I, Mark Laidlaw from Australia, is a colleague I've worked with a long time. We started looking at the times of the year when blood lead levels are high, times of the year when they're low. And the surprise is, of course, that the blood lead levels go up during the summertime, and actually we've known this for quite a while, and go down during the winter time. And this is sort of an introduction to the idea that, well, if children are inside the houses during the winter time in a northern climate, you would expect that the paint in the house was going to be driving their blood lead levels. In fact, that's not when you see the highest blood lead levels. You see it during the summertime, especially towards the end of July and early August and into August. That's when blood lead levels are highest. And that took place in Flint. And there's a couple of possibilities. One is that the warmer water also dissolved more lead from the pipes. But the outside soil is a major contributor to the rise and fall of blood lead over a year. And so that's the first idea, that there's a seasonality associated with exposure. In the Flint case, we have something else that has been, when you follow through the blood lead levels over the years, you discover that since 1998, there's been a remarkable reduction in blood lead levels. And that's true in every city in the country. These reductions are clearly related to something else other than water in the city of Flint. What has taken place to result in the reduction of blood lead? You can see here that 50% of the children had a blood lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter or greater in Flint back in 1998, 99, and today it's about 7%. And in the case, in above 10 micrograms per deciliter, a similar type of reduction taking place. I mean, these kinds of numbers, we used to think of 10 as okay, and then it turns out, no, that wasn't okay. 5, that's not okay either. There is no safe level of exposure. So place matters has to do with thinking about what occurs in an urban environment. And what we know in New Orleans is that the interior of the city, the lifespan, which is sort of an overview of the health problems throughout the entire lifespan, is around 55 to 60 years in the interior of the city. In the outlying area, it's around 77 to 80 years. Right there, an enormous disparity. Now, how do we explain that disparity? Well, we talk about living near streets, heavy streets, traffic flows. We talk about children's stress. We talk about abuse and neglect, economic stress, gun violence, learning disorders, and aggravated assault. And it turns out that all of these have a common possible source of the reason that the problems are taking place in the first place, and that's lead-induced morbidity. Lead-induced morbidity refers to many different types of diseases, multi-organ diseases that are related to lead exposure. And this is a list. Preeclampsia, we've done a lot of work in New Orleans on preeclampsia. The highlight areas of the city are the places where the highest preeclampsia takes place. Learning disabilities, this is well known. Motor neuron diseases are a group of diseases that are very important types of diseases. Alzheimer's is now recently recognized as part of the problems that are taking place. So there are some special needs of children. Blood lead during early development tends to rise rather quickly as a child is in especially the crawling stage development, and then undergoes a reduction. And the crawling stage here, we're talking about somewhere around 18 to 24 months, the highest blood lead you will see during that period of time, and then undergoes a reduction. Okay. Research perspective on the topic was the pioneer in this work was Herbert Needleman. And from my perspective, Herbert Needleman's work really gave value to my work, because what he was describing was the lead exposure as measured in tooth lead, and how as there's an increase in the amount of tooth lead, there was a decrease in the abilities to learn in many different categories of learning. So that was extremely important work, and it gave value to the work that I was doing on urban environments at the time in Baltimore. Let's see, will this work? I don't know if it will, but we'll try. Let's see, if I go to, I want to illustrate problem with lead with a Overview.
Even the ancient Romans who used lead for plumbing knew it was toxic, though they didn't understand why. Today, we do. Cincinnati Children's Hospital and the University of Cincinnati have been following children exposed to lead into adulthood. It's the longest running study of its kind in the world.
Nervous? A little bit.
Dr. Kim Cecil is an investigator for the Cincinnati lead study.
So lead tricks the body into thinking it's calcium. Whenever lead has got into your body, primarily through ingestion, it goes and hides where calcium should be, in the bones and in the cells of the brain. Visualize a neuron. There's the neuron that's sending the signal, then another that's receiving the signal. And typically calcium is in that gap.
Calcium is essential for neurons to communicate. But when a child is exposed to lead, lead gets in that gap and blocks the flow of calcium. Without calcium, synapses get weaker and brain function suffers.
The average IQ of the Cincinnati lead study is 86. It should be 100 in a typically developing population.
Lead can disrupt brain growth and even lead to shrinkage or volume loss in brain tissue.
I can give you kind of the hint of volume loss. You can see these ventricles look plump because there's less brain. From this analysis, I can tell you that most of that volume loss is in the frontal lobe, and that region of the brain is responsible for what makes us the most human. It controls our decision-making, our ability to pay attention, our ability to plan, to make judgment, to evaluate rewards, all the things that we need in life to be successful.
Lead can cause harm wherever it ends up in the body. And lead poisoning can even be passed to the next generation.
If you're a pregnant woman exposed to lead when you were a child, that lead is stored in your bones, and when your body needs calcium for the developing fetus, it's pulling lead out of the bone instead of calcium in many cases.
So, this is a good scientific explanation, and certainly one I'm interested in pharmacology, as to what the damage is taking place as a result of lead exposure. And it directly impacts a part of the brain and actually results in a shrinkage of the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that is called the executive function part of the brain. And that has enormous implications on our society. This is a diagram. It's the air lead behavior in New Orleans. It's the 22-year lag between air lead on the left and the assault rate, 22-year lag. And you see that they are parallel to each other. This is not the first time that this has been described. Actually, it's been described at the national level, the state level, the county level. We did it at the city level because we had good data on the amount of lead over years in the city of New Orleans. The problem, one of the problems we have, and this is a terrible ethical problem, is that we're using our children to measure the amount of lead in the environment. We can't be doing this. Medical ethics are at issue here. We use children's blood lead as the indicator for exposure. We know there's no known safe lead exposure, but that's what we've been doing, and we've done it in the state of Louisiana to the extent that I actually have tens of thousands of blood lead samples that I work with from the state. That's an awful lot of pain delivered to a lot of children. And what do we do about this? Well, when we find out a child has high lead levels, then we try to do an intervention. And the standard intervention comes from the federal government. Basically, we say that lead-based paint is the common exposure. That may be true for the very highest exposures, but for the general population, as I will show you, that doesn't seem to be the case. So, if we're finding a child that's lead exposed, we look for the paint. And if we talk about paint, the next thing we start realizing that a lot of people want to get rid of the lead. How do they do this? They sand their buildings off. They do things that release the dust. When we see high lead levels, and I get a call about high lead levels, that's the first question. Have you been sanding? Has your neighbor been sanding? That would trigger the lead dust going into the environment, and through hand to mouth and also inhalation, you end up with exposure. So there seems to be a problem here. Furthermore, as in medicine, there's a group called the Cochrane Collaboration. It's Cochrane medical reviews that are done in interventions. Cochrane Collaboration looked at the primary prevention, or the prevention methods that are used in the U.S. Supposedly primary, they're not. They're secondary prevention after the child is exposed. We educate our parents and we try to conduct the dust control. Well, of course, houses need to be clean. Where children are, you've got to, that's the standard of cleanliness is very important. But there's some other problems with this approach, and that is that they're not looking at the outside environment at all. Soils are left out of the equation. In fact, the screening according to the federal government, should be done only if there's a paint chip in the soil. If there's not a paint chip in the soil, don't bother taking a soil sample. But that doesn't make sense, as you will see. So that is one of the definitions of insanity, doing the same thing over and putting more and more money into a program that medically has been determined not to be effective at reducing the exposure of children. So let's take a trip back and pay attention to what happened in terms of distributing lead into the environment. The critical issues regarding lead aerosols in cities come from the work of Claire Patterson. And he wrote in the National Academy of Sciences a report called Lead in the Human Environment. Sometime in the near future, probably will be shown that older urban areas of the United States have been rendered more or less uninhabitable by the millions of tons of poisonous industrial lead residues that have accumulated in cities during the past century. Uninhabitable cities is what he's describing. He did not have data to support his idea, but he had a tremendous amount of research behind him, looking at the amount of lead globally in the Arctic, and actually did Antarctic work, and found that in the layers of ice and snow, that there was an increasing amount of lead showing up, especially starting in the 1940s and 50s. A lot of work has been done on snow cover. What did we need to know about the lead problem that was not fully nailed down by Claire Patterson? Well, one thing we needed to know is that lead was put into gasoline in 1925. And that was a decision, it was a policy decision made by the federal government. But not everybody agreed with that policy decision, and one person who stands out that was extremely important, he opposed the idea of putting lead into gasoline, was Yandell Henderson. And he said, This is probably the greatest single question in public health that has ever faced the American public. The question whether the action of government is guided by scientific advice or whether commercial interests are allowed to subordinate every other consideration to that of profit. Very powerful statement. And this is in the proceedings of a conference that made the decision, they were trying to make the decision of whether or not they allow tetraethyl lead to be put into fuel. The other problem that we had early on was that we didn't have any analytical tools they weren't significantly powerful analytical tools to even measure the amount of lead either in the environment or in health, for health reasons, in tissue and body fluids. The development of the analytical tools then became very important in terms of being able to do the work that I'll be describing for the city of New Orleans and other places. In the 1960s, an acceptable lead exposure was 60 micrograms per deciliter. We now say there's no safe level of exposure known, and here 60 was accepted in the 1960s. It's mind-blowing, actually. By the 1970s, 40, in 1975, 30, these are the micrograms per deciliter that was recognized as a guideline. Then it went to 10 and down to 5, and probably should be 3.5 right now or lower, based on the way in which we calculate out the reference value for blood lead. And we do have a new tool available to us now, the XRF. So I did this work, my work started in the 1970s, 42 years ago, in Baltimore, Maryland, 1976. I worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and we started the BUG project, the Baltimore Urban Garden Project. And the BUG project, we got samples from urban gardens all across the metropolitan area and started paying attention to where the high levels were and the low levels of lead and other elements. We didn't just look at lead. Okay, so another fact, another characteristic you need to be aware of is the particle size. The particle sizes are illustrated here. Basically, that's a single human hair. The ring around the hair is dust or pollen particles that are 10 microns in size, very small particles. And the ring around each one of these are 2.5 or less than 2.5 microns in size. Extremely small particles, totally invisible. We didn't know that. The automobile in traffic flows were creating tremendous amounts of material into the atmosphere at the time. And these were inhalable and absorbable straight into the lungs. One of the characteristics of these particles is that they're very dense. They get captured on the sides of buildings and houses. I mean, buildings and trees even. Any vertical surface, the lead particles get captured and then fall down. So you can imagine that there'd be a lot of lead showing up around houses, often play areas, that children are using and are provided by the parents for the child. And the example on the right is the playground, a play area with, it turned out to be very high lead levels. That was in St. Paul. Okay. The human relevance became very clear after we started taking lead out of gasoline. Unleaded gasoline became common in beginning 1975 when a catalytic converter was added. And at that point, there was a steady decline in the amount of lead in the air, and concurrent with that decline was a decline in blood lead levels of the children. So the human relevance became clear that we had to do something. And the interesting thing to me, I was living in Minnesota when this data was coming out, and the state started following blood lead levels, and they started seeing a rise taking place in blood lead levels. Why a rise in blood lead levels? It turns out EPA changed the way in which they calculated the amount of lead in gasoline. And in the course of doing that, blood lead levels started going back up again. And at that point, the state of Minnesota started realizing that they had no control whatsoever over a major source of lead in the environment, showing up in the environment. And all they could do is do something about smelter sites and local, very local types of sources. But they had no possibility of doing anything about lead in gasoline because that was illegal for the state of Minnesota to do. So the state legislature, when they realized they couldn't ban lead in gasoline, they asked, then in petitioned Congress to ban lead in gasoline. And I was invited to make a case in the state of Minnesota. Let's see, I guess I have one over there. The millions of tons of lead and lead dust are extraordinarily large. We're talking about 6 million tons in tetraethyl lead alone, along with another 6 million tons in paint. So the combination paint and gas meant 12 million tons. We can account for 12 million tons in these two sources. The hearing took place June 22nd, 1984. What spurred a great deal of my interest and concern is that my daughter became lead poisoned. And I could not understand why she was being lead poisoned until I started looking at state data and realized that all children were being poisoned at that time. And we had to do something about it. And I worked with a coalition it was called the Lead Coalition, to get lead out. So my arguments in the testimony were basically that the tetraethyl lead was a major source of lead dust, and that cities and states want to protect their children, like Minnesota, who really were concerned, but they couldn't do it. It's illegal. So their children, we understood they were at the greatest risk, and we felt that in order for society to prosper, we had to, in a sustainable manner, we could not be poisoning our children. We supported a bill that was actually by the House of Representatives for a January 1st, 1986 reduction in the amount of lead in gasoline, a rapid reduction. And the Senate was going with the EPA idea of January 1st, 1996, 10 years later. My argument was 10 more years was another couple of generations of children that were going to be excessively exposed. And we didn't know what the changes were going to be in the amount of lead in gasoline. So a rapid phase down took place January 1st, 1986. We have a continuing problem with lead in gasoline. It's legal for avgas. Some pilots are now insisting on unleaded gasoline, and there are some airports, these are general aviation airports, where small piston planes are landing, fueling up, taking off again. And the small piston planes currently are producing about 63% of the amount of lead in the atmosphere, according to current standard measurements. Problem is that avgas goes through the same pipelines as unleaded gas, so there's an allowable amount of lead in unleaded gasoline. And if you're not keeping track of what's taking place and you deregulate the whole system, we could end up with a lot more lead in gasoline once again, unknowing to us. Okay? The relevance for humans is that when we started taking lead out of gasoline, 10 years later, this is 1994, we saw a remarkable reduction in the amount of blood lead. In 1976 to 80, before lead was being taken out, seriously taken out, about 9 out of 10 children were being excessively exposed above 10 micrograms per deciliter. Now we say 5, should be 3.5 based on the work the way in which we calculate what is the reference value. In 1988 through 91, there was a phenomenal reduction in the amount of blood lead. And that was a very important outcome of removing lead from gasoline. So, other things that I've done is I've looked at the urban lead legacy, the legacy of lead in the U.S., and we could estimate this by traffic flows in cities across the country. And from 1950 to 1986, we had traffic data for 90 cities that we put into a spreadsheet and managed to calculate the amount of lead that had been deposited during that period of time into cities. For New Orleans, it was around 10,500 metric tons of lead that was deposited or combusted in the city, and the particle sizes we were looking at would be those that would be deposited within the city. So, New Orleans. We had great data before Katrina, and so we looked at, my team was looking at the soil lead across the city. This is based on about over 5,000 samples collected by census tracts across the city of New Orleans. And then the state was collecting blood lead. And in the blood lead, pre-Katrina, this is the pattern we saw. You start looking at those two patterns, they're very close to each other. And statistically, they match up very well. The amount of lead in the environment is, the children are very sensitive to the amount of lead in the environment. They're picking it up, and it shows up in their blood. We are then able to use the same data to model the amount of lead that might be acceptable. And this is based actually on the pre-Katrina work. None of these samples were collected after Katrina in this particular diagram. And what we noticed is that there was a very rapid rise in blood lead levels at soil lead levels below 100 parts per million. The standard that's been used is 400 parts per million, which I argued a long time about, because, and I know I was at the table when that standard was made. It was made by the industry. They said they couldn't afford to clean up soils at 100 parts per million in our cities. It would make them go bankrupt. So what we're doing is bankrupting our children. The tenfold margin of safety that I'm used to working with in pharmacology means that instead of 400 parts per million, it should be more like 40 parts per million. And that's what we see in the city of New Orleans. And we need to recalculate this with our new data. The margin of safety concept is extremely important. We know something about margin of safety in the city of New Orleans. We didn't have one when Katrina hit. In fact, the margin of safety was 0.7, and any good engineer would say, gee, that means that if it was used in the way that it was designed for, it would collapse. That's what happened. The safety margin was 0.7. if you fly an airplane, the margins of safety are 20, very high, and for good reason. But the city, I guess, we can get in boats when things collapse and move around. We have big problems. So dust in the topsoil turns out to be a driver for the amount of lead being found on the surface of the soil. And I've given these in micrograms per square meter. Most of you are familiar with micrograms per square foot. Micrograms per square foot is just by factor essentially of 10. So for the standard that is currently being talked about a lot, but not necessarily used, is 10 micrograms per square foot for the interior floor. If you have 10 micrograms per square foot, if you have a soil that contains 400 parts per million, you have 1,620 micrograms that you pick up on the surface. We use what we call a plop sampler, and the plop sampler is on the left. You can see it's basically a bag that contains the white, and turn it over, put it on the soil, and then measure the amount of lead you pick up per square area. And we come up with some very large numbers with relatively small amounts of lead in the soil. And I think I would challenge anybody who's doing surveying in houses to go outside and take a wipe on a sidewalk, hard surface. You'll find a lot of soil, of lead in a hard surface. Okay. So I'm in pharmacology and I'm thinking about metabolism. And what we start realizing is that we have metabolism of cities. That cities have inputs that take place, they have transformations, they have outputs that are occurring. And the right-hand side of this, if you have high contaminated air, you get inhalation. Contaminated air will also fall on the ground, and then you have hand-to-mouth activities occurring. That the contaminated soil can be tracked inside the house. That contaminated soil seasonally is resuspended back into the air, once again resulting in inhalation taking place. So that is the kind of cycle we feel is very important in understanding the metabolism of the city. When New Orleans was flooded, 80% of it was flooded. Soil lead, we knew soil lead pre-Katrina. We went back and surveyed the city post-Katrina. And the post-Katrina surveys, we suddenly realized there was a tremendous reduction in both soil lead and blood lead of the children that were living in the city. And that reduction gave us the understanding that at least there was another way of thinking about what to do with the lead that has accumulated in the soil. Mimic Katrina. Bring in samples from outside the city into the inside of the city and cover grounds. And this doesn't work quite right, so it's a little, one choice would remove the city, remove the people from the city. The other would be to bring new materials into the city. Moving people out of the city is not acceptable. So let's see, this doesn't work. Let's see if I can make it work. Oh, here. Sorry. Just trying to pick that. Okay. Let's see if this works. Doesn't work. I don't know why. Okay. Well, what we do is we put down a geotextile on very sensitive properties, and these are child care center properties. The geotextile is a material that is easily available. It's made in large quantities, and it is permeable, so water goes through it. And then on the top of the geotextile, we bring in clean soil that we have really ample clean soil coming by us at a rate of 100 tons per minute from the Mississippi River. And we can use that material. It's very clean, very low in lead. The main organics are in the water column, not in the materials, the sediments that are part of the river. So you can imagine a truckload showing up. These are students from one of my classes. They use wheelbarrows to bring the material into the city, and we end up then with a very clean environment. And in a rather short period of time, we can clean up soil, in this case from 750 parts per million down to 5 parts per million. A matter of hours to do that. So these are the work being done by wheelbarrow, bringing it into a backyard of a child care center. And in this case, the one-time cost was about $100 per child, but over 10 years it would be $10 per child. It would be fairly inexpensive compared to other things that are done. So that is the idea of bringing in soil into the city, not disturbing the soil that is there that's contaminated, but rather bring in clean soil into the city. In very sensitive properties, we're putting in landscaping material, the geotextile, which is easily available, and we can make big changes in the city in a very short period of time. So I hope that this provides a little background in the thinking that went into thinking about cities, problem of inputs taking place in the city, what the medical problems that are associated with lead, what we did to take lead out, and the cooperation on the part of especially Minnesota in doing blood lead surveys, in soil lead surveys, to testify, to go before Congress to get lead out, and then continue onward in New Orleans with repeating the same studies and finding essentially the same thing. That's what I have. Thank you.
Howard, are there questions from the audience?
Okay.
Hi, I'm really surprised to hear that you're now kind of like a flushing effect on the soil to lessen the lead level. I wonder if other contaminants in places that flood during hurricanes need to be considered, like mercury or what happened to Hurricane Harvey with all the Superfund sites. Just thinking about beyond lead, if the flushing effect also happens, or is there redistribution of toxins?
We looked at, we're measuring 12 different elements at the same time. All of them went down. And PAHs, we haven't been able to do that work. We've run out of funding to continue. But those, we expect that many different elements in the soil have gone down as a result of the sediments washing into the city. Those sediments are very low in metals. We were doing some work on PAHs and PCBs. The lab technician I was working with, after 10 samples, he didn't want to do any more. He said, there's nothing here. Why would I want to do 10 more? And of course, we're always pushing the envelope, trying to figure out what's really there, but they had none. And does it increase again? I have to do another survey in 10 to 20 years to see what has happened in the city. But at this point, we're seeing downward trends, which are, for the inner city, we still have enormous problems. We still have 25% of our children that have blood lead levels above 5. And so we're, this is not like Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan, 7%. We're 25% in our inner city. Enormous problems come out of that for our our society and for New Orleans. I
Can
hope
I
that
have more
answers.
questions before our break? Write your questions down.
A question and a comment. The first one, sometimes like with organics, there was, in the old days, there was a problem of getting the detection level, but for lead, it's always been very easy to get low levels, so the 60 deciliters that you mentioned, that was just totally arbitrary, where you could have looked lower, right?
Couldn't look lower at that time. We didn't have a mass spectrometer available until after the DOD developed the mass spectrometer in order to separate out U-235 from 238. And that was work, actually by a neighbor of mine in Minnesota. Alfred O.C. Neer is the person who did the work to develop a mass spectrometer that was really effective. So that wasn't available.
The other question or comment was, I did some research just south of Baton Rouge in the Mississippi River. The sediment seemed to be contaminated with cadmium that came all the way from like Montana. So I'm not sure that the sediment in the Mississippi River is going to be necessary to clean for all lead, not lead, but
We did look at cadmium as well, and we saw very low numbers compared to what we see in the city. And it turns out cities might, we might have more than we'd like to have. But you're right, our Mississippi River, and it depends on the time of the year and what flushing rate is taking place down the river, can be extremely variable. So I agree with you.
How do we get the city, New York City, to take a serious look at other heavy metals? We represent the people at Nitrate City Housing, Smith. There's heavy lead, there's construction going on, the rebuild. We came up with soil testing of 85 parts per million of arsenic in a children's daycare center. We've contacted every city agency and every state agency, and they've all refused to do further soil testing. Construction's going on. The health department has told us that arsenic is not part of their jurisdiction to go to another agency. I'm very concerned that when they're testing, if they're testing for lead, there should be other testing, but how can, I guess it's great that we're talking about this, but we're dealing with issues now in New York City where we can't get the agencies to come test, and where we found this arsenic was in the daycare center, play area.
I've seen a similar problem in New Orleans. They were using wood chips that were made from CCA treated wood. That's copper, arsenic, what is the other? Copper?
Arsenate?
Yeah, chromium, CAC. And that was used to treat wood to prevent termites and other things. And somehow a contractor got a hold of the CCA wood and chipped it up and then put it on playgrounds. And that had to all be removed. It was at a school playground, and it was a terrible arsenic issue. The other arsenic issues we see are around old playground equipment that were CCA treated right at the base of the slide and at the place where the children are really playing, had very high arsenic in the city of New Orleans. So you could predict high arsenic on the basis of whether or not there was a playground there. And if it was an old playground, it had high arsenic.
Well, we got the daycare center to tell us they're not going to put the children in this play area. They're going to use the playground across the street. We photographed it a week later. They're using Roundup on that playground. Okay? The city health department here has stated in their last pesticide survey that Roundup isn't that bad, but when it comes in contact with heavy metal soils, it's definitely dangerous. And yet, even with all of that, we still can't get the city health department or DEP to come test, those soils.
Well, legacy lead in this case is going to have to be a little broader. It's a good starting point. And, I'm talking about lead because it's so easy to measure in blood right now and so easy to measure in the environment. But the same discussion will have to take place for other substances, toxins in the environment as well. And hopefully a group like this will call this to make the demands and work towards improving that, the situation and the outcome.
Let's just do a couple more questions, and I'll make sure.
I was wondering if you had data from other countries, like, developing countries and the European countries, and how does the U.S. compare those countries, like the European and countries like China, maybe India?
We've done cross studies with Norway, taking the inner city parks and comparing them with our inner city parks, and what we discover is that whatever we're looking at, it's a factor of 10. And Norwegians had 10 times less lead in their inner city parks, and these were fairly clean. Those were more like the suburban parks in New Orleans. So European, what we're seeing is much lower contamination for European soils, and they're doing more work on measuring soil. I've done some work and haven't looked at the samples from China yet, but I had a group of students that were out taking soil samples in Xi'an, and we're trying to work that. The data's been collected, but we just haven't worked on it yet, so I can't tell you about that. I can tell you about Africa. I've done quite a bit of work in the busiest areas in Malawi, got samples, sent them back, and then the diplomatic pouch, I always wondered what went in diplomatic pouch. A lot of dirt went from Malawi back to the U.S., but we measured it. It was very low compared to anything we see in the U.S., and it has to do with traffic volumes and how much lead and calcium is being consumed. Most countries are now entirely phasing out lead and calcium. Go ahead.
So I think of Cat in the Hat comes back, you know the story. The pink thing keeps traveling, and that's my analogy. So I was going to ask earlier about storms, and if it washes with the earlier speaker about soil reclamation, if you put new soil down, it will get washed away in a storm. So you're saying that what happened in Katrina was the toxic stuff washed away. Is it the soil that got washed away, the toxic soil got washed away, or the soil got washed? And then the last thing is the analogy of the pink stuff going, it doesn't go away, it just moves. Will
Yeah.
we find it in the Arctic when they do the next test after that water washes out? Because I'm trying to imagine if it doesn't go away, it just moves, where is it going?
That's an excellent question. There's quite a bit of work done on what the halving rate would be of lead in soil. And if you look at the top 20 centimeters, the halving rate turns out to be around 700 years, centuries. But if you look at the very surface of the soil, we're seeing a halving rate of around a decade or two. But that's still not going to be sufficient for the areas of the city that have very high lead levels in the soils, because it will be a continuing exposure for decades. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think it was a lot of new material washed into the city from the coastal area that was clean. And water maybe it was sitting for a while, may have driven some of the fine particles into the soil. Those details are important to understand, and we just don't have the capacity to really sort those out.
Does the same happen in the brain? Does the lead just go somewhere else in the body? So the 22-year-olds who had high levels when they were children, are they still toxic, or the damage is done and the lead has gone out of their body?
It's stored in the bone. Yes, and that's the Cincinnati work started realizing that a mother's exposure during childhood ultimately ended up in the mother's fetus later on in life getting exposed to lead, her lead that she was exposed to. There's a preferential movement of calcium from the bone to the fetus. And if there's lead in that bone, then there's going to be lead going to the fetus. And that's devastating to me. It's multi-generational exposure that takes place for people who are highly exposed. So, we've got to figure out how to maintain, change this dynamic that's occurred.
Yeah, you showed also that the children's levels went up and down in the summer and winter, and everyone who's growing cells in culture like I have, and you have to, know that you use chelators. I'm just wondering if there's something that actually could effectively remove lead, maybe even mitigate the bone storage.
Not without damage. When you're chelating, you're taking, it's a shotgun approach to removing metals, and it includes all of the essential metals along with those that you're trying to get at is lead, and that doesn't take place until about 40 micrograms per deciliter.
And the chelators are different activity than just
Yeah.
every cabbage you eat, you're just chelating. I'm just curious if anybody's looked at the potential rates of removal or take things out of the body.
There was an excellent study done back in the 1980s on chelating. They had two groups of children. One group of children, and they at that point were about 15 micrograms per deciliter. One group of children were chelated, and the second group of children were controls, didn't do the chelation, and they discovered that the children who were chelated had worse outcomes as an outcome to the study in psychological and other problems seemed to be exacerbated by the chelating of lead. And what became clear is the lead that was being removed from the bones was ending up in the brain. So it was displacement to another place. Whereas the children that were controlled actually had, they weren't having a lower lead in their blood, but they were ending up with about the same.
Well, I think we could keep asking Howard questions forever, so please write them down and we'll collect them. Let's give Howard a round of applause.